Thanks, all of you, for coming out to component-based theming with UI Patterns and Pattern Lab. I am Brian Perry, really excited to be back at this camp. This is a great camp. And excited to talk about one of my all-time favorite modules, which is very exciting. So I am, again, Brian Perry. I'm an interactive developer at a company called HS2 Solutions. I live in the Chicago suburbs. It's kind of a popular opinion these days, but I am a lover of all things component and component-based. So building with a component-based approach in Drupal, pattern libraries like Pattern Lab, and then also increasingly building using a component approach in JavaScript frameworks like React. And then I'm also a lover of all things Nintendo. So if you want to talk to me about the cool stuff you're playing on your Switch, happy to talk about that. I gave this camp at Texas Camp last week, and after saying that, somebody came up to me after the session and showed me like an arm full of Nintendo tattoos. So he wins forever, but happy to talk about anything Nintendo related. And I'm on the internet in various places and would love to internet with you. And as I mentioned, I work at a company called HS2 Solutions. We've got a couple of offices in the Chicago area. I get to work with a great team of Drupal folks. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do at HS2, but I learn so much from the people that I work with. So I'd say that if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure there are people that I can get you in touch with who would love to talk to you. So we're going to talk about the UI Patterns module with our time here today. And the simple way I like to describe the UI Patterns module is that it lets you define components in a way that Drupal can better understand. But to kind of understand what the benefit of that is, I think it helps to kind of take a step back and look at just component-based theming in general in Drupal and common practices without the UI Patterns module. So that's where we're going to start. So just talking about component-based theming in general, I feel like more and more people are familiar with this concept these days, so I'll keep it kind of high level. But what is it? It's the idea of building using modular and reusable elements, creating a design system rather than a series of individual pages. It's popularized by the atomic design concepts by Brad Frost. So we see that image down on the bottom, and we have the smallest element of an atom that can be combined into more complex components like molecules, all the way through to templates, which can then be applied to individual instances of pages. And then it's often used alongside living style guides or pattern libraries that can be used for documentation and prototyping. So things like Pattern Lab, which we'll be focusing on a little bit today in some of our examples, or something like FRACTAL. And then increasingly the pattern library is kind of also becoming a source of truth for the design system. So it seems to be going even beyond just a prototyping tool these days. So why would you take this approach? A lot of reasons. Nice, efficient reuse. So you build these components and then can reuse them in consistent ways. So it could be in a single project. It could be across multiple Drupal projects. Or if your pattern library is an external dependency to your Drupal theme, for example, it could be even beyond just Drupal. And then you get nice, well-isolated chunks of code, especially if you're following like a naming convention like BEM. You can pretty clearly see, which component is which and what of its individual parts are. And then it opens up the door to decoupling front-end and back-end development. So you can build these components in isolation, define how they're supposed to look, feel, and behave before the functionality actually exists in your CMS. So theming doesn't have to be the thing that you rush and jam in at the end of a project necessarily. And then there's the benefits of using a living style guide or a pattern library. And that can simplify the coordination between different groups. So designers and developers, even developers and developers. A great place for prototyping, and as I mentioned, more and more these pattern libraries and design systems seem to be its own source of truth for a project. So now let's take a look at kind of a common approach to component-based theming in Drupal, where you are taking a pattern library and trying to integrate that into a Drupal project. Perfect. Okay, that was my invisible component that we were going to be looking at. So the example that we're going to be starting out with is this component. It's from Foundation's building block kits. So they have a bunch of prepackaged components. This is the marketing site content section component, really snappy name, but nice little simple component here. It has an image, header, subheader, and a call to action button. So let's look at the component itself in your pattern library, in this case in Pattern Lab. So inside of a directory in Pattern Lab, typically you'll have a directory that has all of the pieces that you need to render this component. So you see an example on the right here for this particular component, but you might have things like a Sass partial that applies to that component, or a CSS file that gets rendered, a Twig template in this case that has its markup. If there's any specific interactivity for it, you might have a JavaScript file. Other assets like images or SVGs or things like that could live here too. And then you can also have data for your pattern or pattern library. So in the case of Pattern Lab, we have the YAML file here, which has example data that get passed into the different fields in your pattern. And then also a markdown file that can have some general documentation about the component as well. But again, all of this stuff just lives in its own little directory, nice, neatly packaged place where all of the things that you need to make this component exist. So just a really quick look at the markup and styles for this. So again, this comes from Foundation's building block kits. Class naming is not quite BEM structure, but still you can kind of see there's the div that has a marketing site content section class, so the overall wrapper for the component. And then elements inside of it, so marketing site content section image, block, subheader, all that stuff. And then you see some Twig variables there, image, header, subheader, etc., where the data gets passed into this component. And then there's the Sass partial on the right-hand side. Not going to go into that in detail, really, but you can just see that the general structure of the markup is kind of followed in the partial, so you can still see, what pieces and elements of the component the styles apply to. So now that we have all of these things, we can build our pattern library and see this component in Pattern Lab. Here's a screenshot of what it looks like. It looks like what we expect. We see some of our documentation, example markup. So again, now this component exists in our pattern library, and we can start thinking about how are we going to use that in our Drupal theme. So a little bit of a tangent here, but so I talk about the concept of having your pattern library be an external dependency to your theme. You don't necessarily have to do that. It could live inside of your theme. There's a lot of other ways that you could do this, but I wanted to just talk about one way that you could achieve this if you did want to have your pattern library be an external dependency to your project. So you could do this by having, so your pattern library has a composer JSON file that defines it as something that you can include and require via composer. And then in your Drupal project that is managed using composer, you add an entry for your repository that your pattern library lives in. And then another thing that I do in this particular workflow is require a composer copy file. We'll get to that in a second. But then you can require your pattern library in the composer file at the root of your project, so it gets in the vendor directory with all of your other dependencies. And then I use that composer copy file to move the pattern lab, in this case, into the theme, so that you don't have to dig it out of the vendor directory where everything lives. So it's just every time you update this dependency, you'll get the latest code from your pattern library. So that's how you do that if it's an external dependency. There's a handful of other ways you could do that, including not doing that at all, and including pattern library in your theme. I've certainly seen that a lot. Or you could have like a Git submodule that has your pattern library as well. Working on a blog post related to some of that. The ultimate form of stalling, to mention in a talk that I'm working on a blog post. Okay, but now we have the pattern library and all of its templates and code in our theme. But by default, Drupal will only look in the templates directory for templates, which makes sense because it's called templates. Way to go, Drupal, making sense. But there is a module called component libraries, which what that allows you to do is define Twig namespaces so that Drupal can look someplace other than the templates directory for your templates. So in the themes info.yaml file here, we have a component libraries entry, and we provide, we give an ID for the namespaces and then provide a path where it's going to look for those templates. So here we have our pattern lab that's in our theme but not in our templates directory, and we're just telling Drupal where to go find it. And then in addition to Drupal actually being able to use those templates, you also get the nice namespace here. So we defined marketing, so we can do @marketing, and that's just a little shortcut to that path, and then we can, from there, specify where our Twig template is. So now on the Drupal side of things, we're trying to kind of connect Drupal to our pattern library component. And the approach here is using what's sometimes called the presenter template. So in this particular example, there's a paragraph type that relates to this component. So we're using the default template suggestion for that paragraph. And in there, we're going to include the marketing site content section Twig template from our pattern library and map to pass the Drupal variables along to that template. So this template basically is kind of a middleman that communicates between Drupal and our template in our pattern library. So we say include and have the path to the Twig templates in our pattern library. Then we say with, and we list out all of the variables from our templates, and then we provide the data in that template from Drupal that gets passed through. This is a paragraph template, so the fields that we set up here in this case are pretty well related to the component that we're trying to render. So content.field image, header, and so on. Mapping's pretty simple. And so we do that, and when we render this paragraph, we're going to see the component that we expect, rendered as we expected, with the data through from Drupal. So that approach definitely works, and it's things that I've done on projects. There are a lot of themes that do this. This is a common approach. But I've found that the kind of more you follow this through, the hairier it can get. So this example is just a card component, the kind of default component theming example here. But you'll see here that there's like an image source field, alt text, and to get at that, you start to have to know a little bit more about what's happening within a render array or on the Drupal side of things. So we have to use that file URL function. We got to dig into the render array to get the alt text. So it gets a little bit more complicated to find the right stuff that we need to map in here. You'll have to do some debugging with Kint or something like Kint to do that. So that can be challenging. And then I've also found that, especially as you define your component in your pattern library in isolation, you're often going to define the perfect stripped down version of that component that has no additional wrapping markup, and you know, your image source is going to be its own variable, your alt text is going to be its own variable. And the more you do that, the easier it gets to kind of strip away things that Drupal depends on, like breaking quick edit or having impact on the panels in place editor if you're using that. And then also the card component in this case in your pattern library is kind of a black box to Drupal. The template that includes the card, Drupal knows about and can handle caching there. But the card component that it pulls in, it's really just pulling in the markup for that. It doesn't really know about the card as a thing. So the further that you kind of include or extend into that, the less Drupal really knows about it. And there can be issues with caching, and there are certainly workarounds to invalidate caches when you need to, but it gets kind of tricky. So that is the general approach without the UI patterns module, and kind of some of the challenges that I've experienced. But now let's look at that same sort of example with UI patterns. Finally, how long have we been going here? 15 minutes, and we can finally really get to UI patterns. So the UI patterns module, again, it lets you define and manage components in a way that Drupal understands. It defines these patterns as Drupal plugins, and then you can use those patterns that you've defined with component-friendly modules, things like views and field groups and paragraphs and display suite. And then additionally, it lets you configure the mappings that we talked about in the Drupal Admin UI, which is really nice. It optionally provides a pattern library page in Drupal that's kind of like a stripped-down version of Pattern Lab. And then, because all of this is kind of going through Drupal and Drupal is aware of it, you can do things like pre-process your patterns. There's also ways you can render them programmatically and things like that. So this image here is from the UI Patterns project page, but it kind of gives a nice visual overview of all the pieces of the puzzle here. So that first pink box, the YAML box, by default these patterns are defined in YAML files. It's Drupal 8, there's got to be a YAML file somewhere. And we'll look at exactly how you do that. But then once you define your pattern in YAML, then it gets available, it's made available to Drupal, and then you can use it with those integration modules, they call them. So there's a views, display suite, layouts, and field group sub-modules. And then that allows you to render these patterns in Drupal. And then also there are the kind of dotted line boxes there for Fractal and Pattern Lab. And one of the concepts with the UI patterns module, as I understand it, kind of all along, was that you could explicitly define these patterns, but also they wanted to provide a way that UI patterns could look in your pattern library and automatically derive the patterns in the pattern library, which to me sounded like a little too good to be true when I first heard about it, but we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. Turns out it may not be completely too good to be true. So let's take this same example and look at how we would create a UI pattern for it. So this is our component in the UI patterns library page, what it would look like. There's a label for the pattern, a description, and then a table that has all of the fields in the pattern, along with a bunch of metadata there, and then a preview of the component, just like we would expect to see in Pattern Lab. So let's see how we would actually define this in the YAML file. It's possible to have a YAML file that has multiple patterns in a single file, but I tend to prefer to have individual YAML files for each pattern that maps pretty nicely to how things are handled typically in Pattern Lab too. But let's dig into the pieces here. So you give your pattern an ID, marketing site content section in this case, and then a label and a description. And then the bulk of the work here is defining the fields. So the fields should be named the same as the variables in your Twig template. So we have image, header, subheader, and that allows the data to just pass directly through to the variable in your Twig template. And then you can provide a type that's mainly just used for documentation at this point. a label and a description, and then preview is where you pass in the example data that's used on the preview rendering of your pattern in the library page. So it could be something like image markup like we see here. It could just be a string. And then there's a couple of other nice little features here. So there's this use statement, and that lets you, rather than using the default template suggestion that you would get for this pattern, you can instead say, actually just go right out to this location and use this template. So you can say, actually just go right into my pattern lab instance and use this particular Twig template. And it understands those Twig namespaces as well, which is nice. And then you can also define libraries. So if you have certain assets that this pattern depends on, this example is a CSS file. Maybe more commonly it would be a JavaScript file if there's any specific script that needs to run for this component. But you can define a new library here, and that is going to get loaded when this pattern gets loaded. And you can also reference other existing libraries. So if this pattern has other dependencies, those can be loaded alongside this pattern as well. And then, as I mentioned, there is a default template suggestion that you get as well. So if that use statement approach doesn't really make sense for you, you can use this default template suggestion. You could add your own markup in that template. You could also include or extend into other Twig templates. Although at that point, it probably starts to feel pretty similar to the Twig mapping approach that we looked at before. And you can also pre-process to add additional suggestions if that's helpful too. So we have defined our pattern, and now that pattern shows up in the pattern library page in Drupal. But still at this point, we have to ask ourselves, how can we actually get our data from Drupal to be rendered inside of this component? So from my time learning this module and seeing other people that are new to it, this seems to be the piece where people are initially tripped up in understanding how this works. Exposing your pattern in Drupal to actually use it in Drupal and have actual Drupal data go into your pattern, you have to use one of these integration modules that we touched on before. There are 4 of them. So UI patterns layouts makes your patterns available anywhere that layouts are available in Drupal. UI patterns views makes patterns available as a views row style. UI patterns display suite is one that I don't personally use that much, but you can use patterns where you use display suite field templates. And then UI patterns field group lets you pick these patterns in field groups as well. So I'd say that if you're looking for a place to start, maybe you're trying out this module for the first time, I would enable field layout and enable the UI patterns layouts module. And then anywhere that layouts are exposed in Drupal, you'll see your patterns as well, and you can pick them. And a lot of the examples that we're looking at today also use paragraphs, which are a nice component-friendly option, but in no way is this tied to paragraphs. You can use them in view modes, etc. So, but this example does use paragraphs. So for this component, we created a paragraph type that has the fields that we would expect here. So then after doing that, when we go to the Manage Display tab, under the layout settings, we see all the layouts that are available, but also all of the patterns that we've defined. So we can pick this marketing site content section pattern. And then there's also the pattern settings. So that lets you specify if you want to use the default template field wrappers for your content, or if you just want to pass through the content itself, which is a nice way to kind of strip things down and simplify it a little bit. So then after you save that setting, you'll then see the fields from your pattern, and you can take the fields, in this case this paragraph type, and drag them to the field that they should be rendered inside of. And then at that point, you'll have your component rendered with the data from Drupal that you would expect. So I'll actually jump off now and just demonstrate that in Drupal. just to show some examples, also reinforce it a little bit. But so I have this incredibly complicated Twin Cities demo node here. And it's that same paragraph type that we were looking at, but right now it is set to just display using a one-column layout. So this is the display settings. This just lets us see what happens when we turn on the pattern. So we pick our pattern from the list here, marketing site content section, and we'll use only content for the field template, and save. And then when we do that, we see the fields from the pattern we've defined. And we can just take these fields here, subheader, goes in subheader text, really exciting drag and drop demo action here. Link goes under the more button, image goes in image. And then when we save that, if we go back and re-render this node that has that paragraph, it is going to be rendered using our pattern, as we would expect. So the data just gets passed through, all the styling and markup we expect comes along. And then, just to show another example, so we can do things like, drag around the fields and have them show up in different slots in the pattern. But I'll just show you a case of changing to a different pattern here. So there's also a slider pattern that's defined, and inside of the slider you can have individual slider items. So I'm going to pick the slider item just because that happens to map pretty nicely to the fields that are on this other component. Save that, and we get image for free, amazing. But I'll take the subheader and put this in the quote text, since that's a longer string. And then use the header as the attribution and link as the attribution subhead. Save it, and then now if I go back and reload the node with that paragraph, I see it rendered as a slider item using that pattern. So smaller image, it's a list item, different fields are slided into different portions of the component. So, I don't know how practical that is day to day, being able to, completely switch the rendering to a totally different pattern. But it's nice to see that it's possible, and these patterns can, work with your existing content. So in general, does that make sense to people before we keep going? Cool. I see some head nodding. Yep.
The only content dropped down in the template options.
Yeah.
What is the other thing?
It's default, so that just uses the default field templates. So you're going to get additional wrapping divs. Some front-end people live to make those go away. Yeah, the question was just the default in the pattern settings, what that was. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. All right, so that's kind of a basic example. And now let's talk about a few things beyond the basics. So we're going to look at another component from the foundation building block kits here. This is a testimonial block. So there is a little quote, and then a little icon, and then some attribution. So this is what this component looks like in the patterns library page. We see all the different fields listed out there, and then the preview of the pattern. So let's look at using this with the other integration modules, just so you can get a quick feel for what those can do. So let's say that we have some content that happens to align nicely with these quotes or testimonials, and we want to use them in a view. So render out a handful of them. This is how you do that. You would need to enable the UI patterns views module. And then when you have the views row styling settings, rather than content or fields, you can pick pattern. And then under the style options, you can pick your pattern from the list, like we did elsewhere. And then you get the table below that lets you take the source fields from your content and specify the destination, which are the fields that you defined in your UI pattern. And then, as you would expect, you get rows in your view that are styled using that pattern. And then this is an example of a field group. So using UI patterns field group, You define your field group here. We have all the fields that are related to the variables in this component. And then for format, you can pick pattern, and then you can specify the pattern that you want to use to render. And then at that point, you're going to get a similar table to what we saw before, and you can pick your pattern from the list, and then specify the source field in the field group and what destination field in your pattern it should flow into. And then this is an example with UI Patterns Display Suite, which is not one that I really use. So this is actually an example from the UI Patterns documentation, but it's rendering a button pattern. So you can select your pattern from well, you can say that you want to render your field template as a pattern, and then pick your pattern from the list, and then you get the similar source mapping to destination mapping. So these are individual pieces of a field here, and it's a link that's getting rendered as a button. All right, so those are all of the integration modules and what they can do. And then some other things. So you can render your patterns using a Twig function. So you can say pattern, and then provide the ID of your pattern, and then list out all of the fields and what data you want to pass into them. So the top example is just some static content. And then below, we have an example that has dynamic content. So we have the individual fields getting passed through. That starts to feel a little bit like the Twig mapping examples that we saw before. But it's definitely nice to be able to have this as an option. And then you can also render your patterns programmatically. So we create a quote element here, say that the type is pattern, specify the ID of the pattern, and then we have an array of all of the fields and the data that we pass through there. And then when we render the element, we get our testimonial, like we would expect. So a few things that are kind of common questions I hear for people who use Pattern Lab or other pattern libraries when they're trying to take advantage of this module. So subpatterns. What about patterns that have patterns inside of them? Not an uncommon thing. It's not formally supported by the UI Patterns module at the moment, but there are some ways that you can do that with paragraphs, for example. So if we, so this is, what is it called again? A marketing site feature section that has a header and a subheader, and then one or more features that have the little icon and then some additional text. So if you first define a pattern for the marketing site feature, which we have at the bottom, you can then create a pattern for the marketing site feature section that has those patterns inside of it. So this is what the paragraph would look like. So it has a paragraph that has the two fields that are specific to the overall container, and then it has another paragraph nested inside of it. So you can have one or more of those features, and specify the icon class and the data there, and then it will end up being rendered as the overall component, as long as you define the pattern at each level. So that can get you quite a bit of the way there if you do use paragraphs. And then in your pattern preview file, you can also render patterns inside of your preview. So it's the same example, and if we wanted to have multiple features, we can say the type is pattern, provide the ID of the pattern, and then list out the fields there, so we can have multiple renderings of the pattern inside of that marketing site feature section. So it's nice in that it actually is going to go through the path of rendering the pattern itself, rather than you having to jam in a bunch of example markup. And then another common question is pattern variance. So a pattern, but there's a small difference either in structure or styling. How do we represent those? It's another thing that's on the roadmap, but depending on exactly what you're looking to do, like a modifier Twig variable might be enough. This is a really simple example, but taking that marketing site feature that we saw before, there's just a class for the icon that gets passed in. So it's the same pattern, but depending on the value of that, you're going to get a different icon. So, depending on what you're looking to do, that might get you much of the way there. But then also I kind of wonder, like, do you really want to have all of your different variants of a pattern represented as individual patterns in Drupal? Probably not. I think mostly people just want to see the examples in the pattern library page in Drupal, and maybe at that point that's really just the variants are things that you should represent in Pattern Lab. But okay, so about the workflow. Another thing that I've heard people say when they're introduced to this module and are familiar or using something like Pattern Lab is, well, if you're using this, do you need Pattern Lab at all? How do these things work together? So this is a potential workflow that I see that makes sense to me, where a component might begin its life in Pattern Lab. So you might be building something that doesn't yet exist in Drupal, or a smaller or larger piece of a complicated component, or just doing prototyping. So it starts out in Pattern Lab, and then it will reach a point where a component might graduate to being a UI pattern and being a Drupal-ready version of the component. And that's nice in that it's documented in a lot of different ways. So even just the YAML file itself serves as documentation, but that pattern library page can be documentation. And it's going to be a set of components that people working on this Drupal site know that they should be able to use and render in predictable ways. So the other thing that I'll say here is that we talked about all of the integration modules. There are a lot of different ways that you can take advantage of these patterns and render them. The same issue exists to some extent with the Twig mapping approach as well. But what I would just say in general here is to, you don't have to pick one approach, but do figure out the different ways that you're going to integrate with these patterns and kind of stick to that approach and document it. Because you, from experience, I would say you want to avoid the situation where you have multiple redundant approaches to do the same thing, because that's definitely possible given how open some of this stuff is. Okay. So now let's talk about a few things I've experimented with in contributed modules or themes. So one is using these UI patterns in a contributed theme. How would that work? What does that look like? Probably unsurprising, but given some of the foundation building block kit examples we've looked at, I worked on a theme called Foundation Patterns that implements some of those building block components as UI patterns. So this theme exposes the patterns, but is not really opinionated about how they're used. So when you turn on this theme, you get all of those patterns. You can use them with any of the integration modules that you want, but you will have to configure them. So if you have existing content that you want to render as one of these patterns, you can set up the display options to do that. You could create a new display mode that renders in that way, or content types that happen to align to them. But the theme itself just gives you those patterns and those pieces that you can use. But then there's a configuration module that can be used alongside of it. So that kind of jumpstarts your use of the theme. So it has prepackaged paragraph types that relate to each of those different components, and they're configured out of the box to use those patterns. So you can install this and add the paragraph type to a content type or something like that, and be off and running and being able to kind of start using these components. So I think that approach is kind of interesting in that these patterns can either be open and used however you want with existing content, or can be packaged and kind of turn on and turnkey and ready to go. And then the other thing kind of in the experimenting space is, so we looked at in that image from the project page, the dotted line sections for each of the pattern libraries, the idea of discovering components from your pattern libraries automatically. So at this point, a few weeks ago, on an issue on the UI patterns GitHub, someone shared their work with a FRACTAL integration. And what that did is it went and looked at your FRACTAL instance and automatically derived the patterns and made them available to Drupal. And I took a look at that, and first I was impressed that someone did it. But then the code seemed to make sense to me, so I asked if it would be okay for me to adapt over to Pattern Lab, and did that. So now there is a UI Patterns Pattern Lab module. And so when you enable that, it's going to look in the templates directory for any module or theme, or it will also look at any Twig namespaces that are defined in your theme. And it will look there and see if it can identify any patterns in a Pattern Lab instance. So if it finds a JSON or YAML file that defines the fields for the pattern and a related Twig template, it will create a related pattern in Drupal that you can then use. So I'll quickly show what that looks like in practice because it sounds like magic. It will still probably feel like magic even after we look at the example. But so here I just have this little demo instance. It's using the Bartik theme right now. And this is the patterns library page. There are no patterns defined, so we don't see anything. But I have a sub-theme that is using the Emulsify theme, which is a popular contributed theme that has a Pattern Lab instance inside of it. This is Emulsify's Pattern Lab instance with a bunch of different patterns here: lists, images, buttons, videos, cards, all that stuff. So if I go and switch my theme over to that Emulsify sub-theme, and politely wait a little bit while that happens. Very politely. There we go. And then clear my cache here. While that's happening, I can also show, so in the Emulsify theme, it does define some of those Twig namespaces here. So it's just saying the components live in a directory called components. And then beyond that, it shares the structure of a default Pattern Lab instance. So there's underscore patterns, and then atoms, molecules, etc. But because these Twig namespaces are defined here, the module knows to go out and look for the Pattern Lab instance and see if it can discover anything. And then after we've cleared our cache and switched our theme, if we reload the patterns page here, we will eventually see the Emulsify theme and all of those patterns defined. Yeah, so we have a list of all the patterns it was able to discover, and we see grids and images and videos and block quotes and buttons and all that stuff. So these are now available on the patterns library page, but also things that you can start using within Drupal. So at this point, kind of where I'm at with working with this is that I'm looking to test it with as many different Pattern Lab instances as possible, because I think that will hopefully make it more useful, uncover some bugs. And then the other thing I'm trying to figure out in general is like how practical this really is to use, especially with existing Pattern Lab instances. I'm not 100% convinced that for Pattern Lab instances that were developed without this in mind, with like complicated Twig mapping across different templates, that it'll be worth the effort to go configure things in Drupal that are going to slot easily into that. So I'm wondering if this is more something that you might build with this in mind, so you don't have to duplicate, a YAML file in Pattern Lab and a YAML file in Drupal for the pattern. But, figuring it out. And then related to that, tomorrow morning in the first slot of BOFs, if anybody has a Pattern Lab instance that they are willing to let me take a look at and poke around in, I'd love to see it in general, but I'd also love to take a look at how this could potentially work with that module. So feel free to show up to the BOF or just track me down whenever. And this is mostly here for anybody who pulls down the slides. They're up on the node page for the session on the Twin Cities camp site. But there's a link to the project page. There is a Great UI Patterns channel in the Drupal Twig Slack. The maintainers did a nice introductory talk at DrupalCon Vienna that's worth watching. And then links to some of these other projects that I talked about. And cool. So we definitely have some time for questions if anybody has any. Or not. What if everybody just raised their hand just to stretch it out? No, just kidding. Okay, yeah, if you don't have questions, that's great. Hope this was interesting and helpful, and see you around the camp.